Hey everybody, my name is Dalton Schaefer. I'm a worship pastor and this is my channel, Spirit Truth. Today we're going to talk about 5 mistakes that I made when I first started leading worship. I am so excited about this video and I'm having to be a little bit vulnerable, sharing mistakes that I've made in ministry, but I really believe that you're going to get a lot of value out of this video. So let's jump in. These are 5 mistakes that I really made in ministry. These are 5 things that I wish someone would have come alongside me and shepherded me in and helped me grow in early on. And honestly, some of these took years for me to grow into before I really started seeing traction in my leadership, in my worship ministry, because I was making these mistakes for years. And so let's jump in and start with number 1. The number 1 mistake that I made when I first started leading worship was that I wasn't really willing to admit the areas that I was weak in. And what I mean by that is I was really young. I was 20 years old when I started following Jesus, and I was 20 years old when I started leading worship. I was new to the faith and new to leading worship, and there were a lot of areas that weren't developed yet in my leadership. I wasn't a very strong singer. I wasn't great at leading a band. I didn't know how to organize a worship ministry. In fact, there were all these different areas that I wasn't strong in, but I wasn't really humble enough at 20 years old to begin to receive that feedback. In fact, I think there were a couple of people who kind of spoke into me and encouraged me to grow in some of these areas. And I remember pushing back and going, I think I'm great in those areas already. And the reality was I knew that I was weak, but I wasn't willing to admit it. And so fast forward, it took me about 3 years of full-time ministry before I was ever willing to take a vocal lesson, which I'm a little bit embarrassed to admit that. Not embarrassed to admit that I'm taking vocal lessons, embarrassed to admit that it took me that long to be willing to admit. And honestly, it was one of the greatest decisions that I've made. Taking vocal lessons, even though I'd been in full-time ministry leading worship for years. I could have gotten by continuing to not grow and not develop in that way, but honestly, it's been a huge help to my ministry to just start taking steps. And I don't lose my voice anymore, and I don't feel as limited in my range, and I don't feel like I have to change the key of every song to eliminate the octave jumps just to be able to lead it for my church. And honestly, there are a lot of benefits that have come from me being willing to admit that there was an area that I could grow in. So that was the number 1. Let's go to the number 2 mistake that I made when I first started leading worship, which is this. I did not do a good job casting vision and setting expectation for my worship team. Like I said, when I started leading worship, I was a college student and I was leading a team of primarily other college students. And honestly, we had a lot of fun, but I did not do a good job of casting vision. I did not give my team a big vision for who God is, why He was worthy to be worshiped, the role that worship leading would play in sharing the gospel and making much of Christ and seeing lives changed. I didn't do any of that. We just kind of showed up and played music, and I didn't really set expectations. And so every week when we had rehearsal, it was pretty often that a drummer wouldn't show up, musicians wouldn't come prepared, people hadn't listened to the songs or learned their music. And honestly, that was on me. It was my fault because I never gave expectations for what it would mean to be on the worship team. So I really encourage you, worship leader, cast vision for your worship team. Give them a big view of who God is and why He's worthy to be worshiped and praised, and why our worship leading matters week after week, and why it matters to come to rehearsal prepared. And then set expectations. Let the team know that they have to come to rehearsal if they're going to serve on the team. Let your team know that if they come to rehearsal, they need to come prepared so that we're not wasting each other's time. But whatever you do, make sure that you give clear expectation and clear vision to help draw your team in. And number 3, and honestly, it's kind of related to the last one, but the third mistake that I made when I first started leading worship is I didn't really set the tone for excellence and engagement on my team. And what I mean by that is I would often come to rehearsal not having a great idea of how I wanted the flow of service and songs to go. So I was relying on the rest of my band to just maybe make up how the song should flow. And that was back before we were using click and tracks and these different things that can really help you grow in excellence in those different areas. And so, man, a lot of times I was just kind of like, hey, drummer, like, what do you want to do there? They would be asking me what to play, and I would be telling them, I don't know, whatever you feel like is right. And honestly, it wasn't a great way to lead the worship team. And then I also wasn't memorizing my chords back then, and I would often show up not really prepared. I was so glued to just getting the chords right and trying to sing the notes that I wasn't really engaged. And so then it spilled over to my leadership on Sundays. And once again, I'd be so glued in on my chord chart that I wasn't leading the room. I wasn't really engaging people in worship. I was just trying to get through the songs. And so I really encourage you as worship leaders to set the tone for what serving on the worship team should look like. And so if you want your team to memorize chord charts, well, then you need to be memorizing all of your chords. If you want your vocalists to know their lyrics, then you need to memorize the lyrics. And if you want your team to show up to rehearsal prepared, then we have to show up to rehearsal prepared. And if you want your team and your church to engage in worship, then we can't just be trying to get through the songs. We have to know the songs well enough that we can actually lead people in worship and lead people in what does it mean to engage with God. And number 4, the fourth mistake that I made when I first started leading worship was this. I wasn't very organized, specifically in how I would schedule volunteers. I would find myself on Monday morning or Monday afternoon trying to schedule the band for the upcoming week. And often I would send those requests out, and Monday night, Tuesday, Wednesday morning, I was getting people declining, and it would be Wednesday and we were about to have rehearsal, and I have half a band because nobody was available for that day and I didn't have time to find replacements. And what I've found is that sending out requests the week of oftentimes doesn't really give you enough time to work with people's schedules and think ahead of time about how to fill spots just in case someone's unable to serve. And so at my current church, we actually schedule a month and a half in advance. And so on the 15th of every month, we send out all of the requests for every volunteer for the whole following month. So on the 15th of January, we are sending out all of the requests for February all the way to the first week of March. And what that does is it gives us a lot of runway for people to check their schedule, see if they're available, accept or decline their request, and then you actually have time to find a replacement. It's not the day of rehearsal when you find out someone can't serve. Maybe you have 2, 3, 4 weeks to find a replacement for that person. So I really encourage you, get organized. Think about how you can schedule 1 week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, a month in advance with the volunteers that you're scheduling. Now, I don't think you need to schedule your set list that far in advance. I like to schedule my set list on the week of, but even in that, our church starts thinking ahead about 6 weeks, and we do a 6-week out planning meeting where we at least start to talk about what's the text for the sermon that day, what are some songs that might work. But I really encourage you, get organized in your worship leading. And the 5th mistake that I made when I first started leading worship was that I thought of the role of worship leader primarily as a musical role rather than a pastoral role or a theological role. And what I mean is that I was so concerned with making the band sound good and making sure the songs were right and that there weren't missed notes and all of those aspects of worship leading that I often missed shepherding my team, shepherding the people on Sunday to see the meta-narrative of Scripture, of creation, the fall, the hope we have in Christ, what He did on the cross, the gospel, and the hope that we have now that He will return and make all things new. And I was so concerned with just getting the songs to sound good that I was really missing the opportunity to shepherd my church. And I really missed out on the opportunity to think theologically about the role of the worship leader and how what we do leads people to think deeply about God and how we shape people's view of God and how to worship Him and how we understand approaching God and our prayer lives and all of these different aspects of worship that are so much more than just music. And so I really want to encourage you as a worship leader to think about your role, not just as a musician, but as a pastor and as a theologian. And as you do that, what you will see is that your people will be more engaged in worship. Hey, thank you so much for watching this video. If you found it helpful, would you like this video and subscribe to my channel for updates about future videos that I release? And also, these are not the only mistakes that I've made in leading worship. There are a lot more, but the reality is these are 5 great starting points for evaluating your current ministry and areas that you might be able to grow in as you seek to lead your church and lead your team in biblically formed worship in spirit and truth. If you want to follow me on Facebook and Instagram, you can follow me at Dalton Schaefer Music and at Spirit Truth Worship. We take the vowels out of worship. As always, let's continue to lead our churches and lead our teams in biblically formed worship in spirit and truth. Thanks so much.